Okay, hi there. Welcome to a micro video. In class, just in the last few days, we've been thinking about some of the causes of government failure. This is where government intervention, different policies in an economy, can lead to an inefficient allocation of resources and a loss of social welfare. Often, government failure comes from attempts to solve one or more market failures, but actually can end up making problems worse or creating a different set of difficulties. What we've done in class is think about what we mean by government failure and then think about some examples. So government failure is when intervention to correct one or more market failures leads to a deeper or greater net social welfare loss. In other words, the costs of intervention may well exceed any benefits. So you have to do a sort of cost-benefit approach. Has the intervention worked? And government failure can also happen if the policy decisions introduced fail to create enough of an incentive for people to change their behaviour, be it firms or individuals, the wider population. One way of thinking about government failure is to use three words, each of which begin with the letter I. It's a great way to revise government failure. Ineffectiveness means that policies aren't really working. They're not doing their job. They haven't changed behaviour sufficiently at a micro level. Inefficient means that an intervention may create some distortions in a market. It may cause the price to be either too high, too low, the output to be too high, too low. In other words, the intervention doesn't actually makes the allocation of resources even less efficient. And the third word is inequitable, another word for basically unfairness. Interventions, of course, always cause winners and losers, and it is always worth thinking about the consequences for inequality of income and wealth. So here's what we did in class the other day. I put up on the board 7 examples of government intervention, particular policies, and asked my students to take a few moments to think about a possible government failure arising from each of these. Now, there's no right or wrong answer, and some people may disagree on the answers we're going to post in this video. But here's a chance for you to press the pause button or maybe take a screenshot and think yourself about, could you identify a possible government failure from one or more of these policies? So here's a chance in the video to press the pause button, and when you want to go through them with me, just press play. So 7 interventions, 7 policies. Let's work through some answers here. Again, these are really the result of discussion, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's just for illustrative purposes. The first one, a smoking ban, of course, introduced in the UK in 2007, if memory serves, where all enclosed public spaces had a ban on smoking, including pubs and restaurants. A well-intentioned policy, some would say one of the most important health policies introduced in the last 20, 30, 40 years. But of course there is a potential government failure. What we discussed in class was the increase in litter, people going outside and smoking and literally throwing their cigarettes away in outdoor spaces. And of course a lot of pubs and clubs and other venues, hotels introduced outdoor patio heaters to keep smokers warm outside. And well, useful for them, but of course a big source of emissions, a very wasteful source of emissions according to many people. Second example, the government introduces the landfill tax. Now this was a tax introduced on the weight of waste sent in skips, for example, to registered landfill sites. And again, well-intentioned policy designed to encourage recycling of waste. For example, households doing up their properties, they may well have a skip outside, which sounds fun, to put their waste, their household waste products, their bricks and what have you. Well, a possible government failure there we thought was a rise in illegal fly tipping of waste. This is a well-known problem that to avoid the tax you can dump some waste in a field somewhere, or perhaps by the side of a tributary, and of course that creates extra social costs for councils and the wider community, the dish utility. So fly tipping of waste is a really good example of a government failure linked to that particular policy. Third one is to do with financial economics. The government offers a guarantee to all bank deposits to protect the financial system, to protect savers with money in banks and building societies. And we thought there that whilst again this is an important policy, savers need to know that their savings are to some degree protected, they're insured against risk, but if you insure the banks against risk, that could lead to a moral hazard issue in the sense that if they know they're going to get bailed out, for example, that might encourage them to take bigger risks with their lending, knowing that the losses would be socialised and supported by the government. So deposit protection schemes, whilst in theory a very good idea, can also perhaps lead to increased financial volatility, which we all suffer from. Number 4, we're halfway through now. The government introduces an import tariff on steel. I was thinking here of the Trump government in the States that brought a steel in on tariffs, a tariff on steel against China. The aim being to protect profits and jobs in the domestic steel sectors, in particular states where steel is a big industry. Can you think of government failure linked to that? Well, in class we came up with this point, that a tariff might benefit the steel industry, but a potential distortion or inefficiency is that it increases costs for other industries that use steel as an essential component to raw material. So good examples there will be the vehicle industries and the construction sector. Their costs would go up. So this raises questions of inefficiency and inequity, that you're protecting steel jobs but perhaps increasing costs and prices in other sectors. 3 more. The Scottish Government introduces, as they did, a minimum legal price of 50p, 50 pence per unit of alcohol for all retail sales of alcohol. This was again a well-intentioned public health intervention to try and tackle alcohol abuse and excessive alcohol, and in many ways to try and protect pubs, to prevent supermarkets, for example, selling vast amounts of cheap alcohol. Can you think of a government failure? What did you come up with? In class, we thought that this lots of potential government failures. People might travel to, for example, over the border to England to stock up on cheaper beer. Famous story, I think, of a Tesco in Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is pretty close to the Scottish border, which there's some stories of Scots getting on coach trips pre-pandemic, of course, to buy huge volumes of beer, take them back to Scotland. The other one, of course, is it could encourage people to switch to illicit home brews or other sources of alcohol consumption, and there might be some information failures or some greater risks of doing that. The penultimate example in our little journey through government failure is the government announcing a £10 billion project to widen the M25, the orbital motorway around London, as a way of reducing traffic congestion. This is often mooted as an intervention. To reduce traffic congestion, you should widen the roads, introduce more lanes, smart motorways, etc., get rid of hard shoulders by increasing the amount of road space there is. In theory, that reduces traffic congestion, but hopefully you thought of a criticism of this. We brought in the idea of Say's law, or induced demand. If you build it, they will come. If you create more road space, increased supply of road space actually brings forward more vehicles, and you may well not have any significant effect on congestion. Over time, the roads will simply fill up. It will fill the available road space. We call that induced demand, or Say's law. Supply creates its own demand. And I think it's a valid criticism of just building more motorways to reduce congestion. Our final example, and well done for those of you working through these examples with us, is the government outsources the renovating of social housing, local authority housing, to private construction companies who must bid to win the contract. Contracting out, tendering out, of course, a favoured policy amongst fairly right-wing economists, so-called Thatcherite policies to outsource to the private sector. The big danger there, of course, potentially, as we've seen, is that private sector firms, to win the contract, submit a low bid, and then have to cut costs and corners, and that, of course, can risk the safety of those who have to live in such housing. And of course, it's as I record this video in May of 2021, it's nearly 4 years since the Grenfell disaster, a huge, appalling loss of human life and talent, caused in large part by the cladding, of course, which had been put up in that building, which proved to be appallingly unsafe and created the disaster. On that somber note, there we go. I just want to quickly mention something called the law of unintended consequences. When you're writing about government failure in exams and assessments, this is a go-to point, and you can always say in your evaluation that there's a potential government failure of an intervention. But you then have to develop the point. You have to say why there could be a government failure and why it could be a particular cause of government failure. Well, one of them is the law of unintended consequences. And these are the outcomes that are not foreseen, not predicted, not intended by a purposeful action by the state. And it's often said that in any government intervention, tax, subsidy, maximum, minimum price, whatever it is, there's at least one, often many, unintended, unplanned, unforeseen consequences. And that's largely because, of course, economics is a social science. We cannot predict, forecast accurately how producers and consumers will react, and the law of unintended consequences can then deepen the existing market failure. Let me take you to the mean streets of Hanoi, which was governed by the French at the start of the 20th century. They were plagued with rats, and the French colonial government decided to pay 1 cent per rat tail in a bid, a well-intentioned bid, to eliminate Hanoi's plague-ridden population. So I asked my students, why might this well-intentioned policy have not necessarily gone to plan if you pay 1 cent per rat tail? There were lots of great answers, but one student absolutely smashed it. And they said that if you pay people to bring dead rats in to get money, they have an incentive to grow rats. And indeed, the result was entrepreneurial rat farms in the suburbs of Hanoi making fat profits. In fact, instead of disappearing, the pesky rodents proliferated. A really good example of the law of unintended consequences. So there we go. We've looked at some examples, hopefully some nice topical examples of government intervention in the economy which are designed to solve a market failure but actually potentially causing a different set of problems. It's always a good idea, everybody, to have government failure in your toolkit as an idea to bring into your assessments and your exams. It will really help the evaluation, and hopefully those examples will have done the trick for you. Take care, stay safe, and see you soon.